War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J. M. Dillard. Chapter 5. An observer stumbling upon the Jericho Valley site would have witnessed an eerie phenomenon. 6 humans, 2 in white technicians' jumpsuits, 4 in black, standing shoulder to shoulder in 3-person triangles. Around their bodies, the air crackled faintly with energy. A meditation ritual, perhaps, a communion of consciousness. Renewed by the energy drawn up from the planet's magnetic core, Hashran stirred from his trance to peer through new eyes at his comrades. Beside him, Konar and Hira shielded their faces and squinted at the brilliant alien sun. Their host bodies were already beginning to decay. Hira's host bore a red gash on his forehead. The pale flesh had split open when Hira struck him with a blunt weapon. There were still bruises circling the neck of Konar's host. Hashran's host bore similar marks, but despite its limitations, this human male body was lean and young. He flexed the unfamiliar muscles, testing them. Combined with Hashran's own strength, this body would serve adequately. Nearby, the 3 who formed the advocacy broke off their communion. Hashran looked at them and felt deep hatred for those hidden inside their hosts, Chana, Horek, and Oshar. Strategists from the ruling class who spouted theory, who knew nothing themselves of war, but who planned the battles, decided who would live and who would die. To Hashran, these represented the idiocy of the ruling class, their carelessness, their impatience. Caused the invasion to fail at the moment victory seemed surest. Over the protests of the lower-class scientists who feared not enough was known about the new planet, the government ordered the invasion. It was Hashran's duty to prepare the planet for his people, so they might leave their dying world to start anew. Only, he told himself bitterly, so the ruling class can allow this planet as well to be poisoned by our technology. And so Hashran, member of the military class, was obliged to forsake mate, carrier, children, and home to come to this strange world. He was no lower-class servant. He was Supreme Commander, a member of the elite, in charge of an entire hemisphere's invasion, only to see all his soldiers perish from sickness until at last he too succumbed. He wondered now how many of his people had survived, and how many of them had expired, torn and mangled beyond all awakening when they lost consciousness at the controls and their ships plunged from the sky. 2 of the metal containers he had opened contained the decayed, mortally wounded remnants of such soldiers. Even now he mourned. The Advocate had, of course, survived without scars, having always been protected like a carrier from all violence. The 3 of the Advocate moved and opened their eyes. Small, strange eyes. It would have been far more just, Hashran reflected, for them to have died instead of his soldiers. Chana, the lone female member of the Advocate, stared at Hashran with multicolored eyes, black in the middle, ringed with blue, then white. The body she had chosen was softer, as delicate and pampered as a carrier's. He began to speak to her in his native tongue, but she interrupted, displeased. "Speak as the body you occupy would speak." "Yes, Advocate." The strange sensation of forming unknown words, hearing them with another's ears, yet somehow understanding. "How long have we been inert?" "Unknown at this time." She, Horek, and Oshar frowned up at the harsh yellow sun adrift in a strange blue sky. Horek, the member of the advocacy Hashran despised the most for his lack of intelligence, spoke. His host body was male, slightly older than the others, and his control of it was inept. He articulated the words thickly, clumsily. "But many revolutions around their sun." "These bodies are weak," Hashran challenged, "and contaminated by negative thoughts." The body of his human host was disturbingly disorganized and undisciplined, making control of the body more difficult. The council was correct in its judgment that the Earth inhabitants were of limited fitful intelligence, and therefore could be exterminated without compunction. We would more easily accomplish our mission in our natural state. The three stared at him, then closed their eyes to consider. After a moment, they simultaneously opened them again. "The consensus is," Horik said, "yours is not an accurate statement. These bodies protect us from detection." "Until we know more," Chana added, "we will use the resources available to us." Khashran exchanged a dissatisfied look with Konar and Kira. These two were soldiers, like himself. Although lower ranking, he knew they shared his hatred of the upper-class advisors, but they seemed unwilling to stage a rebellion at the moment. "We surrender to your judgment as always, Advocate," Konar responded, but his tone was slightly grudging. "Do you wish us to release the others so that our battle can continue?" Khashran asked with false helpfulness. The more soldiers revived and free, the better his chances of overpowering the advocacy. Khana nodded, a foreign gesture, yet Khashran understood it, just as he understood the human's language. "Yes, however, the advocacy has concluded there is no time for transmutation now," she said. "Collect our people as they are, in the metal containers." So, she had detected his motive. Khana was by far the shrewdest member of the advocacy. Doing his best to conceal his disappointment, Khashran bowed and moved off with Khira and Konar to do so. Khana stood watching them for a moment. She had correctly guessed the extent of Khashran's bitterness, even before defeat, and the long slumber had overtaken them. Khashran's quick mind made him a useful ally and a formidable enemy, and Khana preferred to keep him the former. Surely there was some way to dispel his anger before harm came to him, or to the advocacy. She turned back to her peers in their pale, hideous bodies, and spoke urgently. "Without the guidance of the Council, we are nothing." "What can be done?" Horik whined. Even the human eyes of his host body managed to reflect the depths of his stupidity. But Oshar, his new flesh white against the black clothing he wore, understood. "Once the Council is aware of our plight, it will know what to do." "Yes," Khana replied, grateful that Oshar's mind, at least, was nearly adequate for the high office he held. "We must contact our home base. They have rather primitive equipment." She pointed with the thick, clumsy arm. The three walked over to examine the transmitter equipment. Oshar picked up the dish and examined it. "It will be adequate if properly refined." They set to work. Harrison adjusted the strap on his helmet and started pedaling through the expansive parking lot. Normally, he was in a great mood by the end of the workday. A day at the Institute left him exhilarated, ready to enjoy the rest of his evening. He realized he was one of the lucky few who got paid for doing what he loved best. But today his mood was particularly sour, thanks to Suzanne McCullough. If she quit the project, he doubted he'd find anyone else qualified to do it. The minute anyone found out what the work was all about, they turned it down. Mass denial. The whole world wanted to forget what had happened 35 years ago, and that frightened him. He had figured Suzanne would be different because of her uncle. Matthew Van Buren's death had been widely publicized, like the deaths of Harrison's parents, yet somehow it wasn't real to her. In spite of the fact that she had been alive during the invasion, although he admitted to himself not that long. And not only had she lost an uncle, but her second cousin, Sylvia Van Buren, had witnessed Matthew's death and subsequently suffered a breakdown from which she never recovered. 2 relatives lost to the alien invasion, and yet the woman went through life trying to pretend the whole thing never happened. He'd checked and discovered she hadn't even requisitioned the samples yet. A bad sign. She'd made up her mind not to do it. She was leaving, or at least wavering. Now I know why Clayton gave up. It's enough to drive someone insane trying to convince people to face what could still happen. Yet he felt that somewhere underneath all her uptightness there was a real person, someone he could work with. He was thinking, if he could just break through that anal retentive facade, at which point he had a brilliantly evil inspiration. It was time to find out the stuff of which Suzanne McCullough was made. He grinned to himself as he plotted, then braked the bike as he spotted her. A few yards ahead, Suzanne was striding through the parking lot, her back to him. She must have been pretty lost in thought, because she didn't look behind her as the brakes squealed. There she goes, 1988 Working Woman of the Year. He glanced down at his watch and almost laughed aloud. Exactly 5:01. Incredible. She'd spent the entire afternoon killing time, not doing the one job she'd been hired to do. But she didn't dare take off 1 minute early. As physically beautiful as she was, Harrison reflected, she was not a pretty sight, marching like a good little corporate soldier to her car in her sensible gray suit, neatly trimmed shoulder-length brown hair, sensible leather briefcase clutched in one fist, the heels of her sensibly low pumps clicking against the asphalt like a metronome. She would grow old and sour in her little cubicle here, just like Guterman. Not if I have anything to do with it. Immediately he was taken aback at himself. What the hell kind of thought was that? As if he cared about what happened to her, as if he had any right. After all, he was engaged to be married. He pushed the thought back and impulsively pedaled up behind her. Still feeling guilty about goofing off on company time? Startled, she jerked her head around, dark hair swinging, but managed to recover. Somehow she didn't seem as defensive now as she'd been just after lunch, but her attitude was still cautious. She slowed her pace. Well, I've got to admit, it's a little weird. He paced her on the bike, balancing, never touching foot to ground even as they slowed. For the first time he noticed the light freckles that covered her pale skin, not at all professional looking, which was no doubt why she tried to minimize them with makeup. He smiled at the thought. I take it you haven't requisitioned those samples yet. That flustered her. She stopped and gestured apologetically with her free hand. I'm sorry, it's just that, well, I kept pretty busy just settling into the office and finding out how things worked. Hey, he said gently, it's perfectly understandable. I wasn't asking for an explanation. Back to old cautious, she narrowed her hazel eyes at him. Nice eyes, Harrison thought, or at least they would be if they weren't so suspicious, and started walking again. Then why did you mention it? My, aren't we defensive, Harrison said cheerfully. I asked because I thought I could save you the hassle of finding the proper requisition forms, filling them out, then trying to figure out who gets them. I can see to it that you get the remains. Remains? Her eyes widened just a bit. I've actually managed to get hold of an undissected alien corpse. Been in someone's freezer in the garage all this time. Believe it or not, it's in pretty good shape. Was a real big hit with the neighborhood kids. He grinned at the thought. But I thought you'd be interested in seeing one close up, and that way you can get as many different types of tissue samples as you need, including the internal organs. She was less than thrilled. Oh, thank you. Instead of the usual 2-day delay, I can get it for you tomorrow morning. Tomorrow, she repeated flatly. Was it his imagination, or was she looking a bit green? That would be good, yes, thank you. He smiled, secretly gloating. No problem. Harrison! A woman's voice floated over from the far end of the parking lot. Over here! He craned his neck and saw Charlotte waving madly as she stood by the open door of the little Mercedes. What the hell was she doing here? He must have forgotten something. Another one of those social functions she so adored. It was one of the few things that really irritated him about her. He loved her because she was bright and witty and had a great sense of humor, and she took very few things seriously, except these damn parties. She was also rich, but he did his best to forgive her that. He nodded at Suzanne. "Excuse me, I'm being paged by my fiancé. Have a pleasant evening." He pedaled the bike over to Charlotte. Yep, a party all right. Charlotte was dressed in a slinky but somehow tasteful cocktail dress of deep emerald green, to bring out the color of her eyes. Her expertly permed blonde hair was done up. He liked it down and flowing, but he had learned through experience that in situations like this one, honesty was not necessarily the best policy. "Char, you look fantastic!" He eyed her appreciatively and bent forward on the bike to give her a light kiss. "Thanks," but her forehead wrinkled as she stared past him at Suzanne. "Who was that?" He got off the bike. "New microbiologist," he said easily, and gave her a big one-armed hug, the other hand on the handlebars. "Suzanne McCullough." She hugged back, but he could tell by the tension in her body that she was staring over his shoulder at Suzanne. He smiled to himself. Charlotte was rich, beautiful, and intelligent, yet for all her seeming self-assurance, she could sometimes be ridiculously insecure. Not that she would ever admit to something as mundane as jealousy. "I thought all microbiologists were nearsighted and balding." Her sharp chin dug into his shoulder as she spoke. He broke the embrace and held her at arm's length to admire her. "Common misconception. Sounds like you've been talking to Norton." "Not me." She put her hands on her hips and adopted a teasingly nagging tone. "We're late, Harrison, for the third time in a row." He feigned ignorance. "For what?" "Bleecker Williams Industries? The Founders' Ball?" He slapped his forehead in exaggerated repentance. "God, how could I ever have forgotten?" "Freud says people don't forget. They simply choose not to remember." She was half smiling when she said it, but he could tell by the spark in her green eyes that underneath her lightness she was honestly angry at him. He tried to jolly her way out of it. "I thought you were an interior designer, not a psychoanalyst." "Same thing." She suddenly became all business. "I brought your clothes. Throw your bike on the rack. You can change in the car." Good old Charlotte. Some women would have waited at home and missed the party entirely, then exploded when the offender arrived home. Not Char. She knew exactly what she wanted, and always found the most efficient way of achieving it. No weeping, no moaning, just doing it. No trying to manipulate him, and then getting furious when it didn't work. Char just told him the way it was going to be. He pretended to cringe meekly. "Whatever you say, Sigmund." Chashran worked with Kira and Konar to load the trailer rig with flats of the rusty barrels, all words he had accessed from the host brain, along with others like forklift, which Konar's host had known how to operate. The task kept them occupied until daylight began to fade, but not so occupied that Chashran did not manage to speak to one of them. "Will the advocacy be any more successful this time than the last?" he asked Kira as she handed him a barrel to load onto the flat. Her dark-haired human host was male, tall and strong as Chashran's, and dressed in the same black clothing he and Konar wore. Neither Chashran nor his host brain could read the expression on the alien face to know Kira's thoughts, and she did not answer immediately. She had served under him, and he knew her to be slow-thinking, but intelligent, and most times able to come to the right conclusion. "I know what you think, Commander," she said at last, "that the upper class make poor-quality military strategists. That is often true." She paused. "But will the Council be willing to support our mission if we harm the advocacy?" "The Council need not know we harmed them. They could simply be casualties of war." Kira looked away. On Mortax, harming a member of the ruling class meant immediate execution. But Kira was wise enough to realize they were no longer on their home planet. I would like to have Konar's opinion for a consensus. But their task did not permit them enough time to question Konar. And then twilight came. Chana appeared alone, just as Konar had forklifted the last flat onto the truck, and Cheshron pulled the rear door of the vehicle closed and fastened it. "Go see the others," she said to Hira and Konar, "and wait with them for instructions from home." They bowed and left, but not without glancing at each other. Did Chana suspect their dissatisfaction? She walked around to the secluded side of the truck and gestured at Cheshron to follow. He did so uneasily. Chana leaned warily against the truck and gazed up at the graying sky. Certainly the host bodies were hideous to look at, thick-limbed, clumsy, most of them a revolting pale color. Some of them were decaying, but Chana's host did not seem to be degenerating as quickly as the others. Cheshron remembered, in spite of his hatred for her office, that in her natural form Chana was an exceptionally lovely female. Somehow it was reflected even in the host body, in her almost graceful movements, the timbre of her voice, her choice of words. Perhaps, he thought, after a time it might be possible to learn to appreciate the human form. His host brain recorded this female's face and body as attractive, though Cheshron remained perplexed as to why. Of course, any attraction he felt for Chana was firmly controlled, since it would remain unrequited. She was a member of the ruling class, he was military, and the penalty for interclass coupling was death. "We will hear from home soon," Chana remarked, still looking up at the sky. "You blame the advocacy for the death of your soldiers, do you not?" She fixed her gaze on him, studying his reaction. "Of course," he said. There was no point in denying something she already knew, and it was no crime to simply assign blame. "If there is fault, it rests on the entire government, not only us three. We were not among those who voted for this early mission. We wanted further environmental tests." "You misrepresent the truth, Advocate. You wanted further tests, but Oshar and Horik favored an early departure. The consensus rendered by your advocacy was in favor of the latter. Perhaps you have forgotten that I was there, in the council chamber." Chana sighed. "What must I do, Cheshron, to prevent our advocacy from being killed by your soldiers?" He stared at her for a moment, impressed by her shrewd mind, her direct speech. A pity she had not been born a soldier. He reached out with a hand. How awkward, these fingers! To make a gesture. 3 fingers folded down, thumb and an index finger forming a V. "I swear solemnly, Chana, whatever may happen to the other members of the advocacy, you will not be harmed." She mimicked his gesture and touched the tips of her index finger and thumb to his, thus forming a triangle. Their pact was sealed. "I understand," she smiled, "but we mustn't stay, or the others will talk." The sky was deepening to black as they walked around the truck and back across the yard to where the others stood. Fascinated by the video display terminal, Horik sat before it and smiled as the flashing lights reflected off his pale, dull face. "Home," he said with reverent longing. Even Cheshron felt the skin of his human body prickle at the word, home. How long had it been since he last stood on Mortax? And with the deep sorrow he knew he would never again return. Next to him, Chana trembled. Horik spoke again. "The Council has heard us. They agree that it is our exposure to radiation which protects us from the microbes that almost destroyed us, and which guarantees our mission success. To keep from becoming ill again, we must regularly expose ourselves to measured doses of radiation." He looked up at all of them. "If we do so, we are sure of success, and Earth will be ours once again."